In 62 years, my father asked me for help exactly once. One morning, one phone call. His voice thin in a way I had never heard before. His chest tight. His left arm going numb. I needed a car. My wife's car was in the garage, full tank. She looked at me in the mirror, set down her brush, and said 7 words I will never forget for the rest of my life. 7 words that ended 12 years of marriage. Not with a fight. Not with a door slamming. With 7 words and the sound of a brush being picked back up. My name is James Calloway. I'm 62 years old, a retired elementary school principal from Savannah, Georgia, and I'm sitting on my front porch right now with a cup of coffee that's gone a little cold because I kept stopping to watch the light move through the oak tree in the yard. It's a quiet, autumn morning. The kind Savannah does better than anywhere else I've ever been. I spent 31 years teaching children about honesty, responsibility, and what it means to show up for the people who count on you. I believed every word of it. What I didn't realize until much later was how long I had been failing to live by it in my own home, in my own marriage, and the life I came back to every evening after teaching those lessons all day. I'm not telling this story because I want sympathy. I have no interest in that. I'm telling it because there was a boundary I should have set years before I finally did. And when I set it, everything changed. If you've ever kept the peace so long you forgot what having peace actually felt like, stay with me. By the end of this story, you'll understand why the quietest decisions are sometimes the most powerful ones. Sandra and I had been married for 12 years when this story begins. We lived in a 2-story colonial on Whitaker Street, the kind of house that looks exactly right from the outside. Fresh paint, a porch swing window boxes she had picked out, and I had installed. From the outside, we looked like people who had built something together. And in many ways, we had. Sandra was good at her work. She sold real estate with the kind of focus that left no room for distraction, and she was respected for it. She moved through the world with a purpose that I had admired early on and learned to work around later. When she was closing a deal, the house went quiet. Dinner happened whenever it happened. Conversations waited. I told myself that was just how driven people operated. I had married a driven woman. That was a good thing. What I didn't examine too closely was how rarely the focus ever turned back toward home, toward me. There were no arguments about it. No dramatic moments I could point to. It was more like a temperature, something you adjust to so gradually that you stop noticing the room has gotten cold. I kept the peace. That was my role, and I had settled into it without ever being asked. I remembered birthdays and handled repairs and made sure the coffee was ready in the morning. I smoothed things over when the edges got sharp and let things go when holding on would have cost too much. I was good at it. I told myself that was what a steady marriage looked like. I was wrong about that, but it took me a long time to see it clearly. Every Friday afternoon, I drove out to my father's place on Gaston Street. Harold Calloway was 80 years old, a retired carpenter, and the most self-sufficient person I had ever known. He had lived alone since my mother passed 14 years earlier, and had never once called to say he was struggling. His yard was kept. His truck ran. His gutters were clean before I ever thought to ask about them. When I pulled up on Fridays, he was usually on the veranda working on something with his hands. A piece of wood, a hinge that needed adjusting, a bird feeder he was repairing for the 3rd time, because it was easier to fix things than to replace them. That was Harold. An old country station played low on the radio he kept just inside the screen door, and a mug of coffee sat on the small table beside his chair, usually half finished and gone cool. I would sit down across from him, and we would talk the way men like Harold talk. Slowly, without rushing toward any particular point. About the weather, about baseball, about a neighbor's new fence, or something he had read in the paper that week. He was sharp. He had always been sharp, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, and remembered everything he heard. He never once asked about Sandra. Not in 12 years of Friday afternoons, not once. I noticed it. Of course I noticed it. But I told myself it was just Harold's way, that he was private. that he didn't involve himself in other people's business, even his own son's. I filed it under things I didn't need to examine and left it there. One Friday, I wandered into his garage while he was finishing his coffee, looking for a clamp he said I could borrow. The garage smelled the way his garages always had: sawdust and motor oil and something faintly sweet from the cedar planks stacked along the back wall. In the far corner, hanging from a single nail, was a small birdhouse. Handmade, painted once, and weathered since, the kind of careful, simple work that takes longer than it looks. I asked him about it. He glanced over from the doorway. "Made that 30 years ago," he said. "Keep meaning to find the right spot for it." I nodded and found the clamp and didn't think about it again. I called that life peaceful. I called the quiet in our house on Whitaker Street stability. I called the distance between Sandra and me something manageable, something adult, something fine. I was wrong about what peace actually felt like. It took losing it completely to understand what I had never really had. I found out on a Tuesday evening that Sandra would not be coming to my father's birthday dinner. She told me in the kitchen while she was going through her work bag, the way you mentioned something minor on your way to something else. An important client had moved their meeting to that evening, and she couldn't reschedule. Her voice carried no conflict about it, no apology in the ordinary sense. Just the fact delivered cleanly, and then she moved on to whatever was next. I said I understood. I probably even nodded. That was the pattern. Something would come up, the explanation would be reasonable on its surface, and I would say I understood. I had a lot of practice saying that. The dinner was at Harold's house on a Saturday evening in early autumn. He had not wanted anything large. A few neighbors, a simple meal, nothing that required fuss. That was Harold's way of celebrating, to allow it just enough to be acknowledged and no more. I arrived a little before 6 with a card and a bottle of his preferred bourbon, the same one every year because he had mentioned once years ago that he liked it, and I had never stopped bringing it. Ray DuPont was already there when I walked in. Ray was 68, a retired firefighter who had lived 3 houses down from Harold for over 20 years. He was a broad, steady man with a handshake that meant something, and a way of being present in a room that made the room feel more settled. He and Harold had been friends, the way older men become friends, through proximity and reliability, and the kind of time that doesn't need to be explained. There were 4 other neighbors all around Harold's age, people who had watched the street change over the decades and stayed anyway. Harold had made a pot of chili, and someone had brought cornbread, and the cake, a simple yellow cake with white frosting, was one Harold had picked up himself from the bakery on Drayton Street. He had put it in the center of the table without ceremony, the way he did everything. We sang to him. He sat through it with the expression of a man tolerating something affectionate, which was as close to delight as Harold usually allowed himself in public. Ray said something that made the table laugh. Harold shook his head, but the corner of his mouth moved. At some point during the evening, Harold put his hand briefly on my shoulder and said quietly enough that only I could hear, "You came. That's enough." He didn't say Sandra's name. He didn't ask where she was. He just said that, and then he went back to his chili. I drove home alone a little after 8:30. The Savannah evening was warm, and the streets were easy, and I had the radio on low. It should have been a simple, pleasant drive. Instead, somewhere on the way back, something in me started going back through time without my permission. Harold's hip surgery 3 years earlier, a full replacement, 6 days in the hospital, and then weeks of physical therapy. I had visited every day I could manage. Sandra had asked once how it went the evening I came home from the surgery, and I had told her it went well, and that was the last it was mentioned. She never asked again. She never sent a card. She never suggested we bring him a meal during the recovery weeks, and I had not thought to point that out until right now, on this drive in the dark. The winter before that, Harold had a respiratory flu that knocked him flat for 2 weeks. I had stopped by several times with groceries and soup from the place on Bull Street that he liked. Sandra had never come with me. Not once. I remembered making an excuse for it in my head at the time, something about her schedule, and letting it go. Christmas, 2 years ago. Sandra had spent the entire week with her own family in Charleston. I had gone to Harold's on Christmas morning alone, and we had eaten the breakfast he made, and watched football, and it had been a perfectly fine day. But she had never suggested we include him. Never once. I had stored each of these things in separate rooms in my mind, closed the doors, and moved on. What I hadn't done until that drive home was open all the doors at the same time and stand in the hallway and look. I tried to close them again. I told myself that not everyone expresses care the same way, that Sandra showed love differently, that her work demanded what it demanded, and that was simply the life we had built. It was a reasonable thing to tell myself. I had told myself versions of it many times. But the doubt didn't leave. It rode in the passenger seat the rest of the way home, and it was still there when I turned onto Whitaker Street. I pulled into the driveway and sat. Sandra's car was in its usual spot. The lights in the front room were on. Everything looked exactly as it always did. I sat in the truck for a moment, engine off, keys in my hand, and I could not have told you what I was waiting for. I just wasn't ready to go inside yet. I didn't know why. I told myself it was nothing. I was getting better at knowing when I was lying to myself. I just wasn't ready to stop yet. The call came early in the morning before the coffee had finished brewing. I picked up on the second ring because Harold never called that early, and in 80 years, he had never once called me first. His voice was thin. Not his voice. Harold Calloway had a voice that filled a room, even when he was being quiet. Something built from decades of working with his hands and knowing what he was doing. This voice was careful in a way that told me he was working very hard to sound calm. He said his chest felt tight. Had felt that way since he woke up. And then, he said his left arm kept going numb, and he wasn't sure what to make of it. I told him I was coming. I hung up and stood in the kitchen for exactly 3 seconds. My truck was at Hendricks Auto on Waters Avenue. Alternator trouble. They had called the day before to say it wouldn't be ready until Friday at the earliest. I knew that. What I was calculating in those 3 seconds was Sandra's car, a silver Lexus SUV, sitting in our garage with a full tank because she had filled it herself 2 days ago. The keys were on the hook by the door to the garage. It would take me 9 minutes to reach Harold Street. Sandra was upstairs. I could hear the familiar sounds of her morning routine, the closet, the hangers, the particular silence of someone focused entirely on preparing to be seen. She had an open house that afternoon, the largest listing of her month of property she had been working toward for weeks. I went upstairs. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom. She was at the mirror working on her hair, dressed already in the way she dressed for the days that mattered most to her. She looked at me in the reflection. I said my father had called. I said his chest was tight and his left arm was going numb, and my truck was in the shop and I needed to borrow her car to get to him right now. She listened. I watched her face in the mirror while she did. When I finished, she looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not name, and then she said calmly, "Call an ambulance. I can't cancel today." I said, "Sandra, his left arm is going numb." She set down the brush. She looked at me directly, not through the mirror. "James," she said, "he's your father, not mine." Then she picked the brush back up and turned back to her reflection. I stood in that doorway for a moment. 1 breath. Maybe 2. I did not raise my voice. I did not say anything else. There was nothing left to say, and somewhere in the back of my mind, in the place that had been quietly accumulating everything for 12 years, I understood that this moment had always been coming. I just hadn't known what form it would take. I went back downstairs. I picked up my phone and I called Ray Dupont. He answered on the second ring. I told him my father had called, that it sounded like a cardiac situation, that my truck was in the shop. Ray said, "Give me 5 minutes." That was it. No pause, no conditions, no negotiation. 5 minutes. I walked to the garage and stood there looking at Sandra's car for a moment. Silver, clean, full tank. I looked at it the way you look at something that has just told you everything you needed to know without saying a word. Then, I walked back through the house, picked up my jacket and my phone and my house keys, and I went to stand by the front door. I stood there and I waited for Ray. The house was quiet behind me. Upstairs, Sandra was still getting ready for her open house. The sound of a drawer opening and closing. The sound of ordinary life continuing without interruption. I was not angry. I want to be clear about that. What I felt standing at that door was not anger. It was something much quieter and much more permanent. It was the feeling of a window that had been clouded for years, finally coming clean. Every excuse I had made, every reasonable explanation I had offered myself, every door I had carefully closed, all of it had just become impossible to believe. I wasn't angry. I was finally completely and quietly awake. Ray pulled up in 4 minutes. I heard his truck before I saw it, the familiar sound of that old Ford easing to the curb, the way Ray did everything without hurry, without drama, without making you feel like you had inconvenienced him. Harold was already at his front door when we arrived. He had his jacket on. That was Harold. He would not be caught unprepared, not even for this. He moved slowly, getting down the porch steps, and I went up to meet him and took his arm, and he let me, which told me more than anything he had said on the phone. We got him into the back seat. I sat beside him. Ray pulled away from the curb without a word. Somewhere on Abercorn Street, Harold said he was sorry for the trouble. He said it, the way he said most things, quietly, and without expecting a response, just putting it out there because it was on his mind. I told him he wasn't troubling anyone. I told him to sit still and let Ray drive. He looked out the window for a moment. Then, he put his hand over mine, where it rested on the seat between us. He didn't say anything else. Neither did I. Ray drove and the old country station played low on his radio, and the three of us rode together through the Savannah morning in the particular quiet of people who have known each other long enough to not need to fill the space. The hospital was busy for that hour. A nurse got Harold into a room within 20 minutes, and the doctor on call, a steady, unhurried man, who spoke in the careful way of someone who has delivered difficult information, many times, ran an EKG, and ordered blood work, and told me Harold had experienced a mild cardiac event. Not a full heart attack, but the body sending a warning that needed to be heard. They would keep him for observation and adjust his medications. He was stable. He was stable. I let that settle for a moment before I went back to the waiting room. The chairs were the hard plastic kind that seem designed to remind you where you are. The lighting was the flattened institutional kind that makes everything look a little older than it is. There was a coffee machine near the elevator that produced something that resembled coffee in color only, and I drank a cup of it without tasting it, because my hands needed something to hold. I checked my phone. Nothing from Sandra. I told myself she might not have seen the time. I checked again, 20 minutes later. Still nothing. Not a single message asking whether Harold had made it to the hospital. Not one word asking whether he was all right. I set the phone face down on my knee and looked at the wall across from me. A while later, I was going through my phone without much purpose, the kind of distracted scrolling you do when your mind is somewhere else entirely, when I opened a folder I rarely used. An old shared email thread I had been copied on months ago. And there, near the bottom of the inbox, I saw a chain of messages Sandra had sent to her sister. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be clear about that. I was not investigating. I was sitting in a hospital waiting room drinking bad coffee, and I found it the way you find something you weren't searching for by accident, in plain sight. I read the first message, then the second. Sandra was asking her sister about legal procedures, specifically about what happens when an elderly person loses the capacity to make their own legal and financial decisions. She was asking how guardianship worked and when it typically became necessary, and what the process looked like for transferring assets in those situations. The emails were from 6 weeks earlier. I closed the phone. I did not read further. I did not need to. I sat with the phone face down in my lap, and I looked at the far wall of the waiting room, and I breathed. The absence of Sandra's name on my screen stopped being a small thing. It became something I could no longer explain away, because carelessness looks a certain way, and what I had just read looked like something else entirely. It looked like planning. It looked like a woman who had decided some time ago that Harold Calloway was not a person to be cared for, but a situation to be managed, and that what came after Harold was worth thinking about carefully. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about 12 years of distance I had called temperament. About Friday afternoons, Harold never once asked where Sandra was. About a birthday dinner she declined without a moment's hesitation. About a man with a numb left arm who was not her problem. I called Ray. He picked up on the first ring. I told him Harold was stable. Ray said, "Thank God," and he meant every syllable of it. I said, "Thank you, Ray, for this morning, for all of it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's what people do, James." I held on to that sentence. I turned it over slowly in my mind the way you turn over something you want to remember exactly. That's what people do. 4 words that manage to say everything about Ray DuPont, and without meaning to everything about Sandra. I sat back in the plastic chair. I did not call Sandra. I did not send a message. I folded my hands in my lap and I looked at nothing in particular, and I let the waiting room be quiet around me. I had spent years trying not to see it. Now, I couldn't unsee it. I arrived at the hospital early the next morning. The hallways were quieter at that hour, the overnight shift giving way to the day staff, and the particular stillness of a building that never fully sleeps, but does briefly slow down. Harold was sitting up when I walked in. The newspaper was open across his lap, and his reading glasses were on, and the thin voice from the phone call yesterday morning was completely gone. He looked like himself. He looked, frankly, like a man who was mildly inconvenienced by being in a hospital bed and was managing his irritation with characteristic dignity. He looked up when I came in, nodded once, and went back to the paper for a moment before folding it and setting it aside. Color was back in his face. His hands were steady. We talked for a while about ordinary things, about the weather coming in off the coast, about a player on his favorite team who had disappointed him recently, about the food which he described in terms I won't repeat here. It was easy. It was the specific ease of 2 people who have been talking to each other long enough that the conversation doesn't always need a direction. Then he took his glasses off and set them on the folded newspaper and looked at me in the way that meant something was coming. He said he wanted to call Margaret Osei. She had drawn up his will 5 years earlier and handled some property paperwork before that. He had her direct number in his wallet, which he had apparently kept with him through the entire hospital admission process, because Harold was Harold. He said he wanted to speak with her that afternoon if she was available. He asked me if I wanted to step out while he made the call. I told him I could give him privacy, that it was no trouble. He looked at me for a moment. "No," he said. "Stay." I sat down in the chair in the corner of the room, and I stayed. Margaret Osei arrived at 2:15 that afternoon. She was a composed woman in her mid-50s, gray blazer leather portfolio, under her arm, the kind of professional presence that makes a room feel orderly, simply by entering it. She shook Harold's hand, and then mine pulled the chair to his bedside, set the portfolio on her knee, and opened it without preamble. Before Harold had said more than a few words about why he had called, Margaret paused. She said there was something she wanted to mention first, something she thought was relevant given the context of the meeting. She said that several months ago her office had received an inquiry. Someone had contacted them, asking general questions about the legal procedures involved when an elderly person loses the capacity to manage their own affairs independently. The inquiry had also touched on how asset transfers typically worked in those circumstances, and when guardianship arrangements became appropriate. The inquiry had not come from Harold, and had not come from anyone he had authorized to contact her. She said she found it unusual. She had not responded to it. She had kept a record of it, as was her practice with inquiries she considered irregular. She said this without drama, in the measured tone of someone presenting a relevant fact, and nothing more. Harold listened to all of it without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once slowly, the way a man nods when he has just been told something he already knew, but needed to hear confirmed out loud. He said, "All right, let's get started." The conversation that followed was methodical and precise. Harold knew exactly what he wanted. The house on Gaston Street paid off for 11 years. The savings accounts. The woodworking tools, every last one. The old truck. Everything he and my mother had built and kept and maintained over 5 decades of careful living. He went through it item by item in a voice that was entirely calm, entirely certain, and entirely without anger. Everything went to me. Sandra's name did not appear anywhere in the document. Not in any clause, not in any provision, not in any line. Her name was simply absent, the way you remove something from a room by deciding without announcement that it no longer belongs there. Margaret made her notes, confirmed the details, told Harold she would have the updated documents filed within 48 hours. She shook his hand, then mine tucked the portfolio under her arm and left with the same quiet efficiency with which she had arrived. The room was still. Harold glanced over at me in the corner, where I had sat without speaking for the entire meeting. He looked at me, the way he had looked at me my whole life, directly, and without any particular need for my reaction. "You don't need to say anything," he said. I didn't. My father made his decision the same way he had always made decisions, quietly, without asking anyone's permission, without anger. He had looked at the facts of the situation, as they were not as anyone might have preferred them to be, and he had acted accordingly. That was Harold Calloway at 80 years old in a hospital bed, the morning after a cardiac event, and it was Harold Calloway at every age I had ever known him. I sat in that corner chair and I watched him pick his newspaper back up, and I thought that I had spent my whole life trying to be half the man he was on his worst day. I drove home from the hospital in the early evening. The Savannah streets were settling into that particular quiet they get when the heat of the day finally releases its hold and the air turns honest. I drove without the radio. I didn't need anything in the car with me except the stillness. I pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment before going in. Not the way I had sat in the truck after Harold's birthday dinner, uncertain and avoiding. This was different. This was a man taking one last breath before walking into something he already understood completely. Sandra was on the couch when I opened the door, perched on the edge of it, both hands around her phone, back straight, dressed still in her work clothes from the morning. She looked up the moment I stepped inside, and I could see from across the room that something had shifted in her face. The careful composure she wore, like a second layer of skin, had developed a crack in it, and underneath the crack was something raw and unsteady. She stood up immediately. She said she needed me to talk to my father. She said this was a misunderstanding, that she had planned to come to the hospital, that she had just needed to get through the open house first, and then she was going to come. She just needed me to understand that, and if I would call Harold and explain, she was sure that he would see it differently. She was sure that he would reconsider. I let her finish. I looked at her steadily, and I asked quietly whether she had been planning to come, or planning to come after the open house was finished. She stopped. The sentence she had been building fell apart somewhere in the middle of it. Then she started again, more carefully this time, and that was when I saw it. Behind the composure, and behind the calculation, and behind 12 years of a particular kind of practice distance, there was something I had not expected to find. There was fear. Not the fear of losing the will, or the house, or any specific thing she could name. It was a deeper fear than that, the fear of a person who has just fully understood the size of what they have lost and cannot find the door back to it. I stood there, and I looked at her, and for one brief moment, I felt something that surprised me. Something close to compassion. Because Sandra was a person carrying things I had never fully been allowed to see, pressures and fears, and whatever it was that had made her the way she was. She was not simple. She was not a villain in a story. She was a woman who had made choices consistently and deliberately, and who was standing now at the place those choices had always been leading. That did not change what those choices were. It did not change a thin voice on the phone asking for help for the first time in 80 years. It did not change a man sitting in the back seat of Ray DuPont's truck with his hand over mine. It did not change a waiting room where my phone had stayed silent for hours while my father's body was being monitored for damage. Compassion and accountability can exist in the same room. I had learned that from 31 years of working with children, and I had somehow forgotten to apply it here until now. I said, "My father made his decision the way you made yours, clearly, deliberately, without asking anyone's permission." She looked at me. She opened her mouth and then closed it. I set my house keys on the table by the door. I picked up the bag I had packed that morning before leaving for the hospital, the one I had left by the stairs. I told her I would be staying at my father's house for the next few days. She said my name. I had spent years keeping the peace. I never noticed I was the only one doing it. I walked to the front door, and I opened it, and I stepped through it, and I pulled it closed behind me. Not hard. There was no slam, no punctuation of anger, no final statement made through the sound of a door. I closed it the way you close a door when you are simply leaving gently, completely, with nothing left to prove. The evening air hit my face, cool and clean and straightforward in the way that only air can be. I walked to my truck. I put my bag on the passenger seat. I started the engine and the radio came on low, something old and unhurried, and I let it play. I pulled out of the driveway onto Whitaker Street, and I drove toward my father's house. I did not look back at the house. There was nothing there I needed to see anymore. I stayed at my father's house on Gaston Street for 3 weeks before I fully understood that I wasn't visiting anymore. I was home. Harold's house had its own rhythms, quiet and reliable, the kind that had been worn smooth over decades. He was up before 6 every morning, the coffee made. By the time I came downstairs, the newspaper already on the kitchen table. We ate breakfast together without ceremony, eggs or oatmeal, depending on what Harold felt like. The morning news, low on the television in the corner, the two of us sitting across from each other, the way we had sat across from each other my whole life. It was ordinary in the best possible sense of that word. After breakfast, Harold usually went to his workbench in the garage. He had a project going, a small cabinet he was building for a neighbor down the street. Nothing complicated, just careful work done carefully. One morning he handed me a piece of sandpaper and pointed to a spot I had missed watching him work on for 3 days. And that was how he taught me things without announcement, by simply including me. I was not good at it. Harold did not seem to mind. He corrected my grip on the plane twice, and my angle once, and then he let me find my way, which was also how he had raised me. Ray DuPont came by most evenings after dinner. He would pull his truck to the curb and come around to the veranda, and Harold would have a third mug of coffee ready without being asked, because Harold always knew. The three of us would sit as the evening cooled around us, the Savannah air settling into that soft, unhurried dark it does in autumn, and we would talk about whatever came up, or we would not talk at all. Ray had a gift for comfortable silence. So did Harold. I was learning it again. I contacted a family law attorney in the 3rd week. I made the appointment without anguish, without second-guessing, without the long internal negotiation I might have expected. The marriage had ended on the morning my father called for help, and the door at the top of the stairs stayed closed. Everything since then had simply been the process of acknowledging what was already true. I did not file from anger. I filed from clarity, which is a different thing entirely, quieter and more permanent and far less exhausting. I also called the director of the Youth Baseball League on Habersham Street. I had coached there for 4 years before I married Sandra, and somewhere in the business of that life, I had let it go always, meaning to return, and never quite finding the time. The director remembered me. He said they had openings for the spring season and that the kids could use someone with my background. I told him I would be there. That Saturday, I drove to the first practice and stood on the same dusty infield I had stood on years before, and a 12-year-old with a crooked batting stance and complete confidence in himself reminded me, without knowing it, exactly why I had spent 31 years in schools. Some things you put down and pick back up and find that they fit your hands better than you remembered. On a Tuesday afternoon, about 10 days into my stay, Harold came to find me in the backyard, where I was reading on the old bench near the fence. He was carrying something. I recognized it before he was halfway across the yard. The birdhouse. The small one from the corner of the garage, handmade 30 years ago, painted once, and weathered since, the one he had always meant to find the right spot for. He held it out to me. "Put it up," he said. I looked at him for a moment. He looked back at me with the expression of a man who has said exactly what he meant and does not feel the need to add to it. I took the birdhouse from his hands. There was a white oak near the back fence, old and broad and unhurried, the kind of tree that has decided it belongs somewhere and proven it over time. I found a nail in Harold's coffee can of miscellaneous hardware on the workbench, borrowed his hammer, and went to the oak. I found the right branch without deliberating too long. I set the nail. I hung the birdhouse. When I stepped back and looked at it, something moved in my chest that I did not have a precise name for. It was not a dramatic feeling. It was quieter than that, more like the release of a breath I had been holding so long I had stopped being aware of it. Something that had been waiting in the wrong corner of the garage for 30 years was finally in the right place. Some things have been ready for a long time. They just needed you to be ready too. That evening, Ray came by, and the three of us sat on the veranda as the light went gold over the oak tree, and then slowly softer, the way Savannah light does at the end of a good day. The birdhouse was just visible from the veranda if you knew where to look, a small, careful thing hanging from the right branch in the right yard. Harold had his coffee. Ray had his. I had mine gone slightly cool because I kept forgetting to drink it. The street was quiet. Somewhere down the block, a screen door opened and closed. A car passed slowly, and then the quiet came back. I sat there, and I did not feel the need to say anything or explain anything or manage anything or fill the silence with the effort of keeping a particular version of life from falling apart. I just sat with two men who had shown up without being asked and without condition, and I let the evening do what evenings do. For the first time in longer than I could honestly account for, the peace I was sitting in was the real kind. Thank you for sitting with this story all the way to the end. It means more than you know. If something here stayed with you, please like and subscribe. It helps more people find their way to stories like this one. This story uses recreated characters and events for storytelling and reflection.